Welcome, everyone, to this week's Cat's Eye on the Future. This week, I decided to take a look at the EU and Western Europe. Last week, we looked at cards for the US, and since I didn't have an interview for this week either, I thought, well, looking across the water to where I actually live, and a number of my listeners live, might also prove interesting to see how the energies either compare or they don't. Now, to be honest, what came up in this reading rather surprised me, and you'll see what that is as we go along. But basically, if you recall, last week, the United States for the next several months going into summer from the spring appears to have a great deal of emotion, but a lot of it is sort of caged or stuck. Now, since I published that reading, we did have the riots in Baltimore, which would show an unleashing of energy, much more like we saw in my original reading for the year. But they now seem to be winding down, so we don't know quite what's going to happen next. However, when we look at what happens in Europe, we get kind of a different picture. And with that, I'm going to just go ahead and go right into the reading, because while I had intended to do more than one topic, as you'll see, this one just kept sort of going on and mostly takes up the entire show. So what I asked this time and the way I phrased it was slightly different from the other reading. I put, what are the most important energies and or events for the EU or Western Europe for the next 3 months? That would be May through July of 2015. Now, I worded it that way because there are countries that are part of Western Europe that are sort of in the zone of EU influence, but are not actually part of the European Union, such as Norway or Switzerland, but sort of politically and economically, they still tend to act kind of as a bloc or at least a region. So that's what I wanted to look at. Well, the first thing I noticed about this reading, especially the side cards, but all of it put together, is a repeating pattern of things starting out really upbeat, really wonderful, refreshing, new, full of promise and hope for the future. Only it gets bogged down and stuck in various ways, depending on the reading. The first card of our side cards, which is what we're going to look at first, is Liberation. Now, this is a card with two people escaping prison on horseback. It's full of wild energy, breaking out, and, basically liberation. And this tells us that some of the trapped and stuck energy we had for the United States will not be being felt in Europe, at least not at first. This was my first surprise. I really expected, because the blocs are so linked culturally and historically, that they would really be pretty much the same, but they're not. This could also explain, though, why energies in the last two readings for both the US and my general reading for the world had this kind of mixed atmosphere of both active and passive energies going on, which, as I mentioned at the time, is kind of unusual, but seems to be a trend here in 2015. In some places, the energies may break out wildly, at the same time they stay stuck in others. And in our modern, closely connected world, they can affect other places more than they might have in the past. So one place breaking out can infect other areas, or at least get noticed in a way that maybe it wouldn't have been 100 years ago, or even 30. Now, I included Western Europe in this reading, as I said, because there are countries in this area that are not specifically part of the EU, but can more or less be considered one giant political bloc. The countries in question do not consider themselves as still politically part of the EU, but they all have trade arrangements, and usually you can visit without a visa, that kind of thing. So they sort of go in lockstep. On the other hand, though, the EU itself as an organization now extends into Eastern Europe and even a bit into the Baltics. So I'm covering those territories as well, although I feel a lot of this really is more Western Europe than Eastern Europe. We can't forget that places like Poland are also part of the EU. So this is a rather large area to read for, especially since, unlike the United States, this isn't all technically one country, but it's rather supposedly an attempt at a social, a political, mostly economic union, but with the individual countries still intact. And that makes it a little harder for the cards to hang on to things, because you do still have the separate units. But once they capture pretty well is that they go along with the liberated feeling of things racing ahead. You know, and I think this perhaps almost out of control feeling, this near escape from prison as shown on the card as I described it, we run smack dab into the tree card right afterwards. And this tree actually works really well with EU because it shows a card with a picture of a tree on it, with its roots going into the earth, and the branches forming a really strong anchor to it. You pretty much exactly the sort of image that I'm sure the bureaucrats in Brussels, which is the capital of the EU, for those who might not know, would just love to envision for a happy collection of countries gradually morphing into some sort of common area. I mean, there's a lot of long-term ideas that eventually it would become sort of the United States of Europe. But on paper, yet that hasn't happened. And I also have to add that a lot of people who live here are not necessarily in favor of seeing that happening. But basically, there's still that sort of that dream of the founders. But anyway, you get this strong, steady tree from which the various branches can reach out, connecting, but still individuals and countries are allowed to promote local products like cheddar cheese or, you know, French wines and things, and they're allowed to keep sort of their national identity. I think for a few fleeting moments, or perhaps a few weeks actually, this next month may seem like progress is finally being made in that direction. I mean, something happens that makes things appear that the way it's going to be a good thing, or that things are going well, and you know it feels like almost a trap is escaped. That escaping from prison on the liberation card makes it look like some sort of problem appears to be solved, and joy is everywhere. Unfortunately, the next two cards indicate that any rejoicing and partying taking place over what appears to be such a narrow escape from stagnation or imprisonment is premature. Right dead in the middle of these cards, we have the pair of cards for the prison and the cave. And I can't think of a better image than that of a rubber band that is stretched out suddenly, seeming to go on forever, breaking free, but instead of either actually breaking and flying away, it snaps back. Right back to where it was before, and perhaps even causing some pain and being even worse than it was the first time, because the energies are not just sort of jailed or stagnated and prevented from going anywhere, but they bring with them this rebound sense of despair, depression, darkness, and retreat that you see in the cave card. Now, to go a little more detail, the prison card shows a young prisoner, a human figure, with chains and manacles holding him or her in a dark cell. They're turned away from the light that's coming through the barred window. So they're totally untrapped and unable to move physically. The plate is empty there beside them, but they choose to turn away even from what little sunshine and light is in the prison. That they wouldn't have to turn that direction, but they do. So this is sort of a combination of being put in prison by things that you cannot control, and then choosing to just sort of remain as trapped as possible. And the cave card is interestingly similar, but instead of being in a cell that's put there by outside forces, the cave is all about intentional self-withdrawal, self-imprisoning, self-hiding, and existing in a state of fear. The figure on this grayscale card, which is very gray, and it has a tiny bit of color, mostly in shades of blue, but it's really a dark card. The figure is hiding inside this darkened cave in a hunched sort of fetal position. Their arms are covering their eyes and their ears so they don't want to see or hear anything. And they are also turned away from the light at the mouth of the cave. Very similar image there, and in both cases, a matter of personal choice. The difference is the prisoner has no choice about being in jail. The person in the cave has chosen to be there. Now, like all cards, both of these cards can have quite positive aspects, believe it or not. Now, the prison card can be about the trapping or stopping of things in our lives or in, say, a country's experience that's harmful and need to have a lid put on. Liberation isn't always positive. It very often is. But let's say something breaks out and you need to put a lid on it. You know, the prison card is about things being trapped, and that can be a good thing. Say if your pet escapes out the door and you need to bring them back, you know, that I've had that happen with my house cat. You know, she runs outside and she's liberated for a whole 5 minutes until I trap her and bring her back. But, you know, but most of the time the prison card is not all that positive, to be honest. It's one of those in the deck that swings more to negative than to positive energy. But again, and the cave card actually has many more positive aspects even than the prison card. Because the cave card in the right context can be about an intentional withdrawal for personal meditation, a desire to not, you know, to go within, to take stock, possibly even to withdraw and be away from things which are in fact overwhelming and that we need to take a break from. And the trick there is to make sure that it comes from a place of intentional healing rather than a place of despair, which is hard to do with the cave card, but anyone who's ever dealt with grief or depression knows that it's a difficult road to walk, and most people will swing back and forth. But again, the cave card, well, less negative than the prison card, is generally not the most positive of cards. So we have these two together right in the middle. And unfortunately, it's not these positive aspects I just mentioned that I'm picking up here. Well, the first two cards in this reading suggest a sudden and joyous escape, a new start, a rebirth, or a birth of something great. These cards almost scream recapture and despair. It's like the prisoner's gotten out, like my cat has run out the door, and now I grabbed her, and she's back in the room, and she's not real happy about it. Especially if I then take her and say lock her in my office, which means she's no longer even free to go to explore the stairs, because I don't want her getting out again and maybe my neighbor is still at the door needing to talk to me. It's that kind of feeling, only much stronger. Because, you know, for a cat, it's only kind of momentary. But for people, we tend to brood on things and really take them to heart. So anyway, we get this message that something that seems wonderful happens suddenly and then is suddenly stopped. And my monkey mind, of course, is drawn immediately to the situation in Greece, which has been a problem for the EU for a while now. And perhaps, you know, a good fulfilling of this energy, or a reasonable fulfilling, would be what seems to be a settlement happening, but then it morphs into something else. So while it appears to be solved, suddenly it isn't. Other issues that could suddenly, you know, come back and bite the EU in this way might be the boat migration from Africa, which has been in the news a lot. Illegal immigration in general is a big deal in the EU right now. The sluggish economy, which has the euro basically balanced with the dollar, has been a big worry. And there's also been a lot of chatter about, you know, that one or more nations, including Greece, or possibly even the UK, leaving the EU. And this has caused a lot of worry and concern. So there might be something that looks like that's been solved. There are also some other issues around the NATO alliance, which is not just the EU, but is part of the EU, and particularly as its involvement in Eastern Europe and places like the Ukraine. And all of this could play a role in our bouncing rubber band. It's just that we don't really know what it is, and that's part of the problem. But whatever it is, it's a situation that seems to go forward and then snaps right back, and snaps in such a way that it's extremely painful and causes people to react the way that you would if you've ever had a rubber band come back and hit you. My hunch is that the Greek situation will play a role here, but that things happen so suddenly, I also have to warn, there's a possibility that it could be something a little more intense and sudden, like a terrorist attack or an emergency event that sends the EU and Western Europe crashing right off whatever high they've managed to be on, and again right back to where they're started. I have a feeling that there are potentials for a terrorist attack during the next 3 months, but it could also be an economic crash or something to do with the immigration and boat people like I mentioned before. There's also the slight hint of natural earth-related issues going on too, but this isn't nearly as strong as something caused by people or human beings. I mean, it could be as simple as they said the Greek government agreeing to something one day and then deciding to break it off a few days or a few weeks later. Or it could be as intense as the collapse of a major bank or a lot of banks, or maybe a military action of some sort, or severe disruption politically in one of the countries in the EU that causes everybody to go, whoa, wait a minute. The only hint we have in terms of directions from this particular part of the reading is the skills card. This card has a bow and arrow on it, and it's usually in a private reading about the skills a person or a group of people that either they have already or they need to have to meet a crisis or a situation. I get this card often with people who are thinking about going back to school or maybe taking on a new job position. You know, do they have the skills to meet this? That's kind of what this card is largely about. But the card actually shows the picture of a weapon, a crossbow, in fact. The sort of bow that is very deadly. It's a bit slower than the usual bows we think of, which are the curved bows, but it requires very little training to use. Crossbows have made a comeback recently in some types of conflict, especially the homemade versions. I've seen crossbows employed in pictures from the Ukraine and other world hotspots, but they're also something that a moderately skilled person can put together from plans in their basement, which is very different from the more frequently bow we think of from the movies, which is the curved bow, because that takes a lot of skill and often up to a year to make. The other thing about the curved bow is, well, it's faster to load and to shoot. It's much more difficult to learn to use and takes a lot of practice to aim properly. So you can hand a crossbow to someone that doesn't really know much of what they're doing and show them how to crank it up, and they can probably point and possibly shoot and kill somebody with it. A curved bow, I've used a curved bow, and, you know, even with a lot of practice, you can often wind up hitting the ground, the tree, the floor. This is why archery ranges have a lot of free area, because when you're learning to shoot, it takes a long time before you make those bullseyes with that kind of bow. So, you know, the advantages of them are, of course, that they're faster, but the crossbow is sort of the almost, not exactly a peasant's weapon, but is something that people can put together easily. So anyway, I'm getting the image of a weapon or something rather sinister that's like a weapon that the average person could use and even build on, that suddenly shoots an arrow into the heart of things. So this is something that may either come from the people themselves or something that is like kind of unexpected from that quarter. It may or may not be an actual weapon in reality or even an attack. It could be simply that whatever occurs snaps the Eurozone back into jail, and it's just so upsetting to people at first that they go hide in their caves. But then they start looking to see what skills they can use in order to deal with the situation. You know, you saw this like at the fall of the Soviet Union, where initially people are in shock, but then they start going back to their houses and say, well, you know, what can we maybe sell on the street corner? Or, you know, what line should we stand in? You know, it's like the old rules aren't working, so we try to figure out what we have that we can make things work in the short term. So the skills card could be about that as well. And for some people, this may be metaphorically using their skills to work their way back to where they wish to be. But for others, I also see in this weapon the potential for picking targets and going after people who may or may not actually be responsible. So we have this little bit of concern here. Again, I can't quite tell if this civil unrest, possibly the result of whatever it is that imprisons, traps the Eurozone, or a potential reaction to an economic tumble that would likely result if the trigger for uprooting the tree is the removal of Greece or another country from the EU. We can't really tell here. Whatever happens, it seems sudden, though, and it's just going to throw a monkey wrench into everything after what looks like a really good period of time. I mean, I'm saying this because of the next two cards, that I'm going to look at the Cat's Eye Tarot. And they almost mirror the first reading, only in miniature, because there's only two of them. But I found that this comparison was almost kind of eerie. The first card is the Queen of Swords. Now, this is our kitty cat deck. This is our Cat's Eye Tarot. So we have a lovely Siamese kitty. And like most weapons, including our crossbow and arrows, our Queen of Swords, her claws are sharp, and she's sharp in a lot of ways. She's a very high intelligence. She has a sense of wit and about her, and she's rather entertaining, but she also herself takes no prisoners when it comes to calling out facts that may or may not want to be polite to point out. Now, we all know people like this. You know, she's the lady at the dinner party, the hostess, who is incredibly entertaining, but also can just tend to then slay with her tongue when she needs to. And you're busy laughing, but you're also bleeding on the floor. This is what kind of energy this card is about. Now, her key words are honesty. She's astute, forthright, witty, and experienced. She suggests that during this period of time, when you take it as an energy feeling, honesty and reality are going to be all important, but they have to be blended with simplicity, because there may be tendencies on the part of the powers that be or the situation in general to overcomplicate things. Sometimes there'll also be distraction in the form of comedy or sarcasm that, well, meant to entertain, actually muddies the waters it was intended to clear up. In other words, someone thinks that they're adding some humor or some explanation. In reality, they're just making the situation worse. As a Scorpio, I can say there's a time for this kind of graveyard humor, and there's a time when it doesn't work, and we get this kind of mixed timing here. Perhaps it's not all that great. The card may or may not be a figure, say, like President Putin of Russia, who seems quite capable of outwitting those who think more slowly than he does. And, you know, in a lot of ways, he's kind of like the cat on the card, who is beloved at home by a lot of people. Not everyone, but he's a popular figure in Russia. And he may only give serious attention, though, to those he thinks are worthy, or at least worth talking to. Putin strikes me as that kind of guy. I mean, even though he's very popular, he's not the sort of, you know, presidential figure that you would think of inviting to your barbecue. It's more, unless you're like one of his oligarchs, he just, you know, it's kind of, and that's again very much Queen of Swords energy. It doesn't matter really that the card itself identifies as a female energy, because if this is about a person or even a nation, it's about someone or something that's crafty, intelligent, and forthright. But in that sense, you know, there's that type of female energy influencing, but they themselves, I mean, don't have to be female. And at the same time that they're doing all this, there's someone or something that is very good at game playing and often can play games so complex that it confuses everyone except possibly themselves. They may know what they're doing, but very often nobody else does. This card probably, though, isn't entirely about Russia or Putin, even though there's a lot of reflection there. But it feels like part of whatever the surprise is may come sort of from his direction or from that area of the world. It has already been noted in the news and in previous readings that there are emotional and cultural links between Russia and Greece, for example. And there's been a lot of tension building between Russia and the Eurozone on that very issue, because people know that if Greece leaves Greece leaves the Euro, Russia is right there ready to step in and has made that quite clear, or at least they've said that they would. So there's this tension going on. So it would not greatly surprise me if our actual surprise that dashes hopes and traps the EU and the public into fear and hiding comes from this direction. And if Russia or Putin is not the actual immediate cause of this sudden shift, they're almost certainly going to take advantage of it. I mean, even if it's something totally from out there that has nothing to do with them, never fear, Putin will be ready to take advantage of any loophole. Now, there's also the potential here that some of this energy is going to spill over onto the EU leaders themselves during the brief period of euphoria when it looks like everything has suddenly worked out perfectly and all is well is being shouted from the towers. A sort of, well, we managed that one brilliantly, didn't we? And then suddenly it all goes pear-shaped as soon as the ink's dry on whatever it is that seems to go well. So there's this almost feeling of being too clever for their own good is what's coming to my mind, or a sense of hubris. Again, it's not required to be an either-or situation, as the same energies will be working to a greater to lesser degree on both the EU and Russia. I plan to look at Russia hopefully next, and may do that next week or the week after, but I have yet to do a reading on that area specifically, since I did one with a few months ago with another reader. So it'll be really interesting to see what forces are pushing there as well. In any event, the celebrating and witty comments and of these two cards read pretty much the same way that collapse into jail and the cave card to the side card reading. Now, why do I say that? That's because our second kitty card is the Six of Swords. This is a picture of a lovely pedigreed kitty. She's a long-haired Himalayan, and she looks sad and dejected, sitting alone in her cat carrier, as only an Oriental cat really can. If you know anything about cats, you know that the Siamese and the Himalayans and that group, they're either really chipper and on, but most of the time, but when they're annoyed, they're really annoyed, and when they're sad, they're really sad. The door to her cage is open. She's in a cat carrier with the door open, but she isn't even bothering to try to come out. She's just sitting there. She feels adrift and no longer in charge of her own destiny. She's probably sick. I mean, the implication is that she's either been or is going to the vet and she's not feeling well. But also she's just depressed. Just like the human on the cave card, she just feels like she can't do anything anymore. She has no self-motivation. The key words for this card from the book that comes with it, from the nice lady that made the Cat's Eye Tarot, is the blues, recovering, or travel. So there's some hope actually in this card that things could move forward or start traveling in the right direction, but only if the kitty is willing to accept that a new direction may be needed, and she has to at least be willing to accept the help that's offered. My mind turned once again to a double reading of this one. First to Greece, which very well may come to the end of its rope, or go back on a seemingly ironclad settlement and then does not need to accept other help to go forward. But the EU Eurozone may find themselves in the same boat after whatever crisis hits it. I get the feeling that whatever this crisis is, it isn't something the EU can solve without at least some international help, that being carried in the cat carrier, or at least help from somewhere. My thoughts are pulling towards North Africa for some reason, not necessarily for help, but part of the situation. But that may or may not be the whole of this. This is just really difficult to get one's head around. I think there is the potential out there for some sort of major crises, but one that results in things being stuck and depressed by midsummer, as opposed to a moving or active response. In other words, whatever it is that happens, people just sort of draw in. Things don't move forward, at least not during the time period I specified. Now, some of this again could be economic, although interesting thing is we don't have any cards specifically for money or even wealth, which I would have expected, and I just don't see. But what I do see is people just start out wanting to sit in the dark and closing their eyes at best in front of their TVs or their computer screens, just feeling rather helpless. They can't do anything. This will partly be, or maybe a self-chosen response on the part of individuals or maybe even whole countries to try to remove themselves from whatever the issue is. But I think like our sick kitty and the cat carrier, they may also be put there initially by events, but they stay there by choice, or at least a sense of despair that makes action really difficult. So we really do have the combination again of the active energies of joy and liberation, the Queen of Swords all on her throne, followed by the rebound into passive energies of stagnation, withdrawal, and depression. You have been listening to part 1 of Cat's Eye on the Future. We'll return to the show right after these short messages. Do you have questions? The cards have answers. If you would like a personal reading with Melody, just go to my website,
melodipsychicreadings.com. That's Melody with an I, psychicreadings.com for information, or email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. Readings are available using Skype, phone, email, or even in person if you are lucky to live in Ireland. Why not find out what special messages the cards have just for you and book a private reading today? We now return to part 2 of Cat's Eye on the Future. So that said, can the runes give us any more information, or perhaps at least some positive aspects to all this mess? In order to get as much insight as possible on this, I decided to do a more complete rune reading for this than I usually do. I go ahead and I start out with my usual 2 runes, but then I expanded it out and asked for more information and pulled 4 more. So this was really more of a complete reading, the sort of thing I would do if I were just doing a rune reading and skipping the cards in the first place. The results were very interesting, and they do tend to echo the card reading. There's a bit more information here, though, which is why I'm going to share it. And there are points to a couple of possible sources for the situation that may be happening, though I would be happier if I had more. But to begin with, let's just go in and go through this first. The first 2 original runes I got were Berkano, which means birth or birch tree, and Wunyo, which is usually translated as joy, but can also be the clan banner, in other words, the flag of the family, or battle flag. The Nords had some very interesting ideas about, what joy was, and there's this certain idea of joy in the family or joys in battle, and also joy defending the family in battle. So you have all 3 of these things sort of mixed up in this rune. So the 2 words though that we have are almost the same energy as our first 2 cards, but instead of liberation and stability, we have birth and joy. Or perhaps the birth of joy. Essentially like a baby being born that expands the clan banner or the family tree. Where did we see that image before? Of course, the other way to look at this reading, the runes being extremely complex set of symbols that they are, would be something like the birth of conflicts or the birth of battles. We'll hope that isn't the case, but that's got to be noted here. Now, given the above reading, both outcomes are not mutually exclusive either, but like the previous reading, suggests that both outcomes may occur but not at the same time. In other words, you can have both this wonderful liberating energy and joy at birth, and then also a battle or something, coming back to take its place. But some other hints we get from just these 2 runes are, once again, we have a female energy. Berkano can also be the mother goddess, or the mother's breast. If you look at it sideways, it can look like a woman's parts that she uses to feed her baby. So we've got nurturing in here. This also causes me to reflect again on the Queen of Swords and wonder perhaps some of what calls our attention during this period, it could actually be an active female leader like Angela Merkel or someone I'm not even thinking of, or at the very least a person, a country, or a situation that is female identified. Now, good examples of nations in this block that we're looking at that are female identified would be, say, Britannia, Spain, which is La España, which is female, and even going a little outside the EU, but part of is touching this reading, Mother Russia. For comparison, Germany, and perhaps by extension, the idea of Greater Germany, which I sort of think of the northern EU countries, at least in terms of the EU, as being sort of Greater Germany, is always referred to as the fatherland. So, we have this very masculine energy, whereas there are countries within here that identify more as female. So, a mother's joy could spell out the family conflict here among EU members, which we could easily be seeing. since that's usually the case a lot of the time, a lot of times conflict are in families, there's likely to be something unusual or notable about this which happens in the next few months. I mean, there's always tension going on in the EU, but something ramps this up, I think. Now, let's take a look at a few more runes to see if we can puzzle out the direction of them, or at least perhaps the direction of big events, both joyful and despairing, just see where they might be coming from. So, this is where, after the foundation of our first 2 runes, I add 4 more. And I'm going to name them and give a brief description and then go back and kind of go over them a bit more. The first rune we have in this 4-rune set is Thurisage. This is sometimes called the Thorn. It resembles one and has energy that tends to force things to happen. Think of a balloon meeting a pin, or a lovely rose that you grab with your fingers, not thinking, and the stem has thorns on it and it causes your hands to bleed. Sometimes bursting a bubble is the best way to go. It's good energy in those situations, but it's almost always painful and sudden. There's a great YouTube video out there about a cat seeing a balloon pop and the cat goes, vertical. That's the kind of, and that fits with the energy of some of our other reading here. This rune can also be about something rising to the surface in order to burst. It's associated with boils and the like, and I sometimes have called it before the sideways volcano rune, because it looks partly like that. Kenage is also a sideways volcano rune, so you've got kind of you've got similar shapes in both, but with Kenage, it's the whole rune, and in Thurisage, it's sort of the top part. So I think of it more as a thorn than of a sideways volcano, but the ideas are still there. Next we have Tiwaj, which is literally translated as the god Tyr, or Tiwaj. Now, interestingly enough, there are hints of the Sky Father in this rune, especially the really ancient concepts. It's probably the closest thing the Norse have to a stern father-like god figure, similar to like the god of the Old Testament for people who accept the Old Testament, or in the Hebraic tradition. But Tyr, or Tiwaj himself, as we come to know him later in the mythology, is best known for sacrificing his hand in order to bind the wolf Fenrir. Now, he loved and raised this wolf from a cub, but then the wolf itself gets so big that it threatens to destroy everything, possibly the whole universe, if it isn't chained up and controlled. So the other gods come to Tyr and say, you gotta do something about this pet of yours. You need to chain it up. And this is a highly intelligent wolf and can understand what Tyr says, and the wolf's suspicious because he's got a chain in his hand. And Tyr promises the wolf that he will put his right hand, his sword hand, in the wolf's mouth as a pledge, so that if he does take the chain and lets him put the chain on the wolf and then refuses to remove it, the wolf can then bite off his sword hand. And of course, that's exactly what happened. He promises to let the wolf take his hand if he betrays him, which of course he does because he has to, because that's the right thing to do. There are no completely right answers in this situation. It's a very good view of the idea of Norse legality here, because yes, he has to lie to the wolf in order for the greater good to happen, but because he's had to commit that lie, he pays for it with his sword hand, which the revenge is personally taken by the wolf that he's now chained up. But the wolf is now prevented from harming anyone else. So Tiwaj is about all the legal aspects of the law, but not necessarily the law as we would understand it, but more the way tribal people might understand it. It's about doing what must be done for the good of the tribe. But in other aspects, like in modern times, this rune also tends to be associated with courts, police, contracts, paperwork, civil servants. You get the idea. It's very legalistic, and mercy is not something you tend to associate with this rune. It's very much the letter of the law, but not quite as we understand it. Now, the Ansuj rune follows, and while this rune is often associated with Odin, who is sometimes called the Allfather, is anyone who reads Marvel Comics knows that. It's not quite all that Odin is, but again, we have this sense of almost the Sky Father. Sometimes this rune is even translated God or mouth. So we have this, coming from Odin. It's a very masculine energy. It's also associated with communications, inspiration, poetry, song, hidden knowledge and wisdom. But it should also be noted that while Odin is considered to be crafty and wise, he also loves strife, conflict, and battles. And Odin's not adverse in the story cycles to stirring things up, especially if he gets bored. Most people associate that with Loki, but they forget that Loki and Odin are blood brothers, and they're kind of two sides of the same coin. It's just that, Loki's tends to be a little more mischievous, and Odin's things like to be a bit more planned. Now, finally, to complete this set of 4, we have Ingwaj, or the seed, which is again linked to another deity. Not all the runes are, but we've got several here that are. And Ing, or Freyr, is the god of harvest, fertility, and of the earth. He's also the god of defensive warfare. People forget that he's not just a harvest deity, but he's also a war deity. In fact, there are entire Scandinavian dynasties whose warlike kings descended from Freyr. One of his animals is the battle boar, but he's usually more about defensive than offensive warfare, which is again why I kind of get this image of things being, the reaction of being defended against rather than, whatever happens. I don't think the EU is the aggressor, at least not initially. Even emotionally, what happens is something that happens to them or as part of a situation. Now, the seed here, of course, is also similar to the tree card, but in this case, we have the potential of the tree, or that strong union, rather than the tree itself. We have the baby tree in its simplest form. We have the potential of the tree, or the potential of things branching out and becoming what could be, but not necessarily what is. So, okay, we have all these amazing symbols and archetypes, very profound. How in the world do we make any sense of it? Well, as I've sort of started to hint in my previous talk here, this actually fits pretty well with the previous card reading, and it fills in a few holes as well, if not perhaps as many as I might like. Now, after we get that initial burst of Berkano birthing joy, something pricks or suddenly occurs that breaks the bubble and brings a light directly onto something that previously been kept in the dark and unseen. Now, this is where we get a bit more information, because now we know that probably what actually causes things to snap through a rubber band are something that was unseen and not noticed. It was overlooked. You see, Thurisage is about stuff that festers and becomes explosive, or something that needs pricking. It's like an infection that, is under there, and now the thorn is going to prick that and bring blood to the surface. It's we all knew the blood was in the body somewhere, but you don't see it unless something pricks it. So we get this feeling of something that eventually is likely to go off, but we don't really think about it happening, and then suddenly it does, because something hits that nerve. Since both Berkano and Thurisage runes have hints of mountains about them, in both cases, mountains that are sideways, I also have to caution that if something happens, seems to come out of it that's associated with mountains or pointed terrain, that's possible. It's kind of a long shot, though. I mean, it's possible that there might be like a slight hint of, say, something happening in Switzerland or the Alps, such as that plane crash that happened, or even, one of the European volcanoes going off, but it's unlikely. Thurisage and Ingwaj, though, also have hints of sex and fertility about them. So, again, sexual scandals or something to do with human reproduction could be part of this. But Thurisage the difference is that between them is that Thurisage is about sex. It's painful and explosive. The rune poem is about how it is the pain for women, if you get the idea. It's not It's the kind of intercourse, it's not the relaxing sort of intercourse you associate with procreation, but it's rather that kind of wild abandon of meltdown and primal lust that comes to a head quickly. Sorry about the pun there, it was very bad, but you get the idea. This can be fun at times, but it's tricky and even dangerous in its purest forms if it's not brought under control. Sort of think of a forest fire here. So we have something that suddenly and probably explosively, literally, again, bad pun, pricks the bubble of freedom that liberates new and joyful energy. Whatever comes from the direction, on the other hand, has legal consequences. So, we immediately, again, poof, something is let out, and then we have T-Wash coming right after it, which, T-Wash can also be about consequences, karma, cause and effect, the results of previous actions, and or earlier conflicts, that maybe with human or tribal agencies or other areas, that comes back literally to rebound and play on this situation. Perhaps tribal justice shows up in the form of revenge, or even a clash of legal paperwork. Either all of these potentials here exist, and I suspect the larger event will lead to many, many smaller manifestations of this as legal and even perhaps maybe some military actions. Remember, T-Wash looks like a spear. Getting anything done is going to make it difficult. T-Wash, because it looks like a spear, it also tends to go right to the heart of the matter, and they refuse to let go easily. And as I said earlier, mercy is just not something usually associated with this rune, but regulations and rules are, as is revenge and counter-revenge. Think of spy versus spy. So again, you got the military and spy stuff possibly going on here too. The seed rune Ingwaj has hints of possibly the free trade agreement under consideration between the EU and the US as one potential source of the problem. One of the big discussions on that one is about GMO foods and other agricultural products that a lot of Europeans are concerned about might suddenly be flooded into Europe if such an agreement is passed. I think this is going to be a topic during this time period, and the rune seems to confirm this, but I'm also called mentally to the aspects of defensive warfare, or at least defensive positions in battles this rune also holds. I think there's going to be a certain amount of back and forth on this issue. I don't think it's going to be the main one, but I also think that the defensive warfare theme may be important. You can view this rune both as the seeds of conflict, just as easily as you can view it as the seeds of the tree. You can also view it as the need to defend in the conflict. This doesn't have to be a military conflict, though. I mean, these are very battle-charged images, but, well, it could be. It could also affect a lot of situations. To some degree, though, you get the feeling of the seed of the conflict or issue or entrapping situation we saw above occurs is based in the T-Wash energy of, kind of spear throwing, legalization, police, that kind of thing, military stuff, and may be sparked by a problem in communications or bad directions and decisions. Now, why do I say that? Remember, the T-Wash rune is about law and paperwork, but also about tribal justice, which includes both the payment of money if harm has been done, but also cycles of revenge and retribution if the wronged party isn't satisfied. What held as being a realistic solution or legal for a Norse Icelander in the 900s can be eerily similar to some of the views held by, say, someone living in North Africa, or even some of the wilder parts of Europe today. The idea that justice may be personal, and it may require personal involvement in the conflict in order to decide the outcome. I'm not saying this is a good idea, but it's a rather factual description of some of the mentality and the reality that Europe has to deal with right now, both inside of Europe itself, which we like to forget about, and outside, particularly in places like North Africa or the Middle East, or even, the Ukraine, where people tend to think in more tribal ways. Whether they call themselves a tribe or not, the family and the clan banner are extremely important. And if you mess with it, people aren't necessarily just going to say, oh, there's pieces of paper signed, we're happy now, we'll all go home. It's a lot more complicated than that. Now, of course, the Ing rune can also be about a fungus attacking the treasured olive trees of southern Europe, which is causing prices of olive oil to skyrocket right now. And I even read that the mafia has gotten involved in trying to like sell subpar olive oil, which sounds almost like the plot of a really bad made for TV movie. It reminds me of Fresno with Carol Burnett and, the Raisin Wars. That was really a comedy show, but it was based on, it was a comedy based on Dallas. And, this kind of thing, to me, the idea of the mafia getting involved in olive oil production has a very similar feel, but it is actually happening. And the EU has actually held emergency meetings to consider growing trees in protected greenhouses and other really drastic solutions because, get your olive oil, folks, because this thing has affected a great deal of the olive trees of Europe and some in the US as well. And it's very possible that the Ingwash seed, Frere Bay is probably not very happy that the seeds of these trees are affected. So that's something to look at. However, the source of the problem seems to be a tree illness accidentally imported from abroad, as I said, from other places. So we have a sort of tiwaj of karmic cause and effect going on here, with the seeds and trees that were imported, for that matter, being affected. And we have, again, confused communications because this interloper, this illness was not supposed to come in, but it came in anyway somehow. And therefore, trade and commerce is just making the situation worse. It isn't meant to be, and you need to have trade, and olive oil is a really old trade, but like so much of this reading, it just all plays in on itself. But overall, what we get here, to clarify, is the same basic message of short-term breakout, joy, or solution that suddenly gets pricked or slammed, depending on how you like to look at it, to a halt by reality. That's the Thorn Rune. A reality that has probably existed for some time right under the surface. It's also Tiwaj, so the Tiwaj Thorn. The Thorn pricks, Tiwaj smashes. The feeling of despair and hopelessness of being trapped in this reality and the bursting bubble itself seem partly rooted, caused, or affected by something either legal or potentially karmic, that what was done now has an effect, cause and effect. The seeds of the problem or incident situation are likely to be found also in a failure to communicate, or possibly from directives on high that may fail to take the total situation under consideration. In other words, something that is confused, just like some of this reading is. It's confused, it's not totally understood, it's not communicated very well, and it becomes a big mix-up. And again, the reason I'm saying this is because of Ansuj. Our final rune here is, as I said before, sometimes translated as mouth, God, or even divine speech. So we get the impression of someone or something, or perhaps a group of people, claiming they speak for God, or have divine inspiration, or have divine communications of some sort. This could be a wonderful thing when it actually seems to work. I mean, lots of great things have been accomplished by people who felt they were under the inspiration of the divine. But there can also be great destruction and damage done by people who believe they, and often they alone, hear the Creator's voice. This could even be true of people who may not actually believe in a God as such, but are listening to themselves as if they were a divine revelation, and take actions that seem correct to them, but maybe exactly the wrong thing if the situation were carefully weighed and thought about. But again, we have this idea of either speaking for God or making moves as if one were God. In other words, taking control of things, or attempting to control things, which I believe, and to a degree, the EU does try to do in a very legalistic way. Sometimes they want to control everything, or at least it can feel that way to people on the ground. There's lots of jokes about the bureaucrats in Brussels and trying to straighten out bent bananas and that kind of thing. And so it's that kind of almost abuse of power, and not always even with intention. It's just this godlike belief that we know better than you do. And sometimes even when it is a good idea, the miscommunication that can happen when you try to relay that to subordinates and people on the ground. Now, I know this reading is rather heavy, and it isn't all bad. I mean, I think some of the joy, birth, stability, and skills energies are going to linger out there, as always, individuals can grab onto them in their personal lives. And the Queen of Swords is actually a really positive, somewhat sharp lady who inspires us with a bit of gallows humor, even as life may be headed down what seems like a dead end. Her wit and laughter can help us challenge the despair we feel and help bring some color to our prison walls, and perhaps even allow us, once we hit the cave, to laugh and sort of come out of it. I'm thinking of, the sun goddess in Japan who goes into her cave and refuses to come out and till, this comic figure comes and makes her laugh, and then the sun shines again, and the, winter stops and summer comes back to the world. And there are a lot of very similar stories in a lot of world mythologies or story cycles, and that's the feeling I'm getting here, is that the properly used comedy and a certain amount of not levity in a wrong sense, but a deliberate intention to try to focus on what humor we can find may be very helpful here. And while I don't know exact nature of the event or potential events that are the causes, sorry about that. I really tried with the rune reading. We got some hints there, but whatever it is, it's such a sudden reversal of hopeful fortune for Western Europe that I can say that either it will happen probably in the next 3 months or by the end of summer at the latest, or there's a potential for people, leaders, and nations to make better choices than it looks like they're going to make right now. And perhaps they will create another potential future, and maybe we can miss all of this. I don't for a moment think that the future is fixed, and being warned about potentials can be useful in avoiding them. A lot of this reading has one strong message about ignoring reality. And if that reality is faced head on with intention, a lot of heartache and sudden stoppage in this reading may be modified. It's still probably going to be there because the energies are still going to be there, but they won't necessarily be as entrapping or perhaps as despairing as they are what looks to be right now. The legal energy of Tiwaj could then be directed towards finding solutions to the issues at hand, rather than throwing everybody in a symbolic country jail where you may continue to hide even after you would actually be safe for you to come out. And a Wunyo with an Ingwaj becomes the seed and the flag of joy and family, rather than that cat carrier in the caves of despair and hopelessness. Finally, if nothing does happen by the coming fall that traps us in the past here indicated, I will be delighted to be wrong, because sometimes the best sort of prophecy or prediction is the event that does not actually take place, because communication has been positive, the information is properly gotten across, and right action is taken before, things go off. It's the one where the city changes its ways and is spared the promised destruction. The one where people stop ignoring karma and deal with it on their own terms instead of waiting until karma deals with them on its own. I have no idea this particular reading was going to be this repetitive or this serious. Especially given, again, as I said in the beginning, how our North American reading was both a period of high emotions, but also where things were pretty stuck for most of it. They break out at the end, but it's kind of almost the opposite of this one, where the liberation energy breaks out immediately and then gets stuck. In Europe, it looks like things are also going to get stuck, but in a profoundly different and very sudden way, as I said before, and only after what looks like an amazing breakthrough, which is actually positively probably makes the whole trapped feeling a lot worse, and could account for this really intense aura of despair that I keep picking up associated with this reading. Let's just hope the leaders in Europe make the right choices and avoid this potential. It turns to be potentially, especially because I live here. Meanwhile, remember, even if you also live on this side of the water, that each card can be used in your own life in a positive way, and I described some ways to do that earlier. You yourself can take charge and confront your own reality as required and take steps to move forward as much as possible. And when you can't go anywhere, if you get stuck like everybody else may be in this potential time period where we all have to stop, you can use your time as a time of quiet withdrawal with intention to increase your skills and be ready to communicate with others should they need them, which they may very well. I think at this point that's about enough for now, though. Reading's given me a lot to think about. I want to thank you all for joining me this week at Cat's Eye on the Future. And I look forward to seeing you again next week when hopefully maybe we'll take a break and have an interview or something. Then we should come back and we'll look at Russia and maybe some other topics. And once again, if there are topics of interest or areas of the world you would like to see readings on or questions, feel free to email me at melodyreader@gmail.com. That's melody with an I @gmail.com. And I can't promise to take all of your questions, but I will read them and consider them. For now, next time, we'll see you back here at Cat's Eye on the Future. You have been listening to Cat's Eye on the Future, the show where we take a look at what's coming up in your world and your future. Join us again next time for another episode of Cat's Eye on the Future.